Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Sanibel Public Library. My name is Duane Shaffer, and I am the Assistant Director of the library and your host for these ongoing World War II programs. Before we begin, I have a couple of announcements to make. The first is that the library, we are here. We are open, and we are here from 10 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. We have many services that are available. What I would like you to know about our programs here is we have, after this one, we have two remaining. On March 17th, we have the Battle at the Cathedral, and this was in downtown Cologne in March 1945. Very interesting battle that was captured on film, actually, and a very well-known correspondent that you may have known, Andy Rooney, was actually there. For our final program, we're going to go to the last battle in the Pacific, and that would be Okinawa. We are going to do that on April 7th. Of course, as you all know, if you follow these programs, somewhere embedded in here, we have a pop quiz. And we would like you to participate. If you get the answer, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine too. I would really like you just to come down to the library, and even if you got it wrong, I'll give you a book. Any comments, questions? My email is the word media@sanlib.org. If you do come to the library, we have a lot of great services. As I said, our World War II collection can be found at 940.54. We do have a World War II book display, and I have someone here that I want you to meet. See if I can get this up there. Whoop. Oh,
He's
there.
in green.
He's a little green. This is Lieutenant Junior Grade Saburo Saki, otherwise known as the Flying Samurai. And he wanted me to let you know, that we have a display of World War II airplanes and tanks. See, look how he disappears. There he is.
Good camouflage.
Camouflage, yes, okay. But do come down to the library. We would like to see you. A very important service that we have recently offered. A lot of people on Sanibel are still struggling with issues at their homes and condos. And guess what? We have a bunch, if I hold it right there, Danny,
Yeah.
we have a bunch of tools that you can come down and borrow. We've got hammers, screwdrivers, clamps, everything you can imagine. Come on down and you can borrow them. Okay, and while you're there, if you don't already have a library card, for heaven's sakes, please get a library card, and you can take out all kinds of materials. We have books, magazines, movies, everything you can imagine. Now the time comes where I have to thank my wonderful production staff, Maureen Tesoro, stand up, Danny, Beth Gerald, and our IT manager, Danny Hussey. Okay, all right. I don't think I have anything else on that. So Danny, let's get started. Okay. All right, the title of our program today is The Divine Wind, Kamikazes in the Pacific. And we're going to set the table for this program just, of course, first by defining what was the kamikaze. This is a word that is part kama and kaze, meaning God wind. This refers to two very nasty storms that occurred in the 13th century. This was a Mongol fleet under Kublai Khan that was invading Japan at the time. You can begin to see some of the parallels. And a divine wind or typhoon came along and destroyed the invading invasion fleet. This happened twice, and this is where the word kamikaze comes from. Okay, so who are all these guys? What are they doing here? Again, we need to set the table a little bit to set up why the kamikazes even happened. We begin first with the East versus West different in perceptions, the differing cultures. And we can talk a little bit about that. Some of these people on here, for heaven's sakes, what's Brad Pitt doing here? Okay. In that movie Fury, he is talking to a commanding officer. And they were very deep in Germany, 1945, yet the Germans were still offering resistance. And the commanding officer says to Brad Pitt, he says, for heaven's sakes, why don't these people just give up? And he says, if you were them, would you give up? Meaning that if there was an invading army in our territory, in America, would we give up? And the guy over there on the other side of the screen, Lord Cornwallis, in the movie Braveheart, much the same thing happens when one of his officers said, why don't these colonists, why don't they just give up? Don't they know they're beaten? And Cornwallis says the same thing. He says, if you were them, would you give up? No. The two pictures in the middle, obviously propaganda pictures, and this is what I was talking about, East versus West. The American perception of the Japanese, Asians in general, was, let's face it, they thought they were an inferior race. They thought they were incapable of developing a navy, an army. And for heaven's sakes, they had the idea that the Japanese would not make good pilots because their mothers carried them on their backs. They thought that they had nothing but inferior knockoff kind of equipment in planes. And the picture over on the left side, of course, this is a samurai, the bold samurai warrior destroying the invading fleets of the Allies. So here's a couple things, again, to understand the whole kamikaze idea. To the Allies, who were steeped in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the sanctity of life, the apparent willingness of the Japanese to just kill themselves was profoundly shocking to them. And I can imagine there's nothing more scary, more frightening than to see an airplane coming straight at you, and he had no intention of pulling up. They were just going to come straight at you and try to sink your ship. The word suicide in the Japanese language does not have any kind of immoral connotation whatsoever. The two versions, jujitsu, meaning self-determination, and jisai, self-judgment, suggest this is an honorable act that's done in the public interest. And one of the Sanibel residents we had, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, Albert Axel, he wrote probably the most important book on the kamikaze called Kamikaze, the Japanese Suicide Gods. And in there, he suggests the three things: honor, loyalty, and duty. And the suggestion is that this is an honorable act done in the public interest, in duty to the emperor, which you see up there in the corner. There is, moreover, no ethical or religious taboos regarding suicide in the Japanese religion of Shintoism. Instead, the samurai warrior code, or Bushido, which is the way of the warrior, was heavily influenced by those religious beliefs. Buddhism, Confucianism, the revered self-sacrifice and fighting to the bitter end for emperor and country. And let's face it, Japan was in a very desperate position, as were the Germans. The noose was tightening around the Japanese. The greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere was shrinking rapidly in the Allied advance. We talked about the Battle of the Philippine Sea last year. As you know, it was also known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And why this is important is that an enormous amount of Japanese pilots were lost. I forget, maybe almost 300 to 400. They had no more real carrier force to put out. So this is when they start becoming really desperate. How are we going to stop the Allies? They're coming for us. We know they're coming for the home islands. How are we going to stop them? And Admiral Onishi, who was the head of the Naval Aviation Development Division, who was responsible for some of the technical details of Pearl Harbor, he became the commander of the first air fleet in the northern Philippines. While he is commonly credited with having devised the tactic of suicide, the project predated his tenure, and there's actually some records that there were suicide attacks in August and September of 1944. A lot of the statistics are kind of all over the map as to who was the first. He said, in my opinion, there's only one way of assuring that our meager strength will be effective. That is to organize suicide attacks with 250 kilogram bombs, each with a plane to crash dive into an enemy carrier. And we're going to talk about how this developed as we go along. Here is Admiral Arima. He is credited with maybe the first organized intentional samurai attack. He got into his Betty twin-engine bomber and attacked the USS Franklin on October 15, 1944. He was killed, and part of his plane hit the Franklin. The Japanese high command latched onto this, and they said, yes, this is the first one. And thus, the special attack, or Tokubitsu Kogiki, Toko for short, was born. And just a side note about the Franklin got a whole bunch of battle stars at the end of the war. It survived this attack, but also would sustain severe damage by 10 more kamikaze hits before the end of the war, and they would lose a total of almost 1,000 sailors killed. Here is a few of the planes for you to take a look at. And we're going to talk, yes, about the planes that were involved in kamikaze attacks, but also a lot of the other types of weapons that were used. Some of them you recognize are quite familiar, like over in the right-hand side middle, we have the Japanese Zero, and a couple of the ones on the left-hand side, the Claude, the Nate. These were all planes that were flying during the Sino-Japanese War in the 30s. And a lot of these planes, for their time, were extremely effective. However, as we know, as the war goes on, a lot of them are going to become obsolete as the Allies put more and more sophisticated aircraft into the field. And of course, this is the most recognizable one. This is the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M with the Nakajima engine. It had a speed of 300 miles an hour. And I know we've talked about this in past presentations, but it's worth reviewing. It had two 20-millimeter cannons in the wing and two 7.7-millimeter machine guns in the nose. The pros of this plane, again, in its time, nothing could beat this plane. It was highly maneuverable, it was light, and it could climb very fast. The cons. The Japanese didn't think that they were going to really be in a very long war when they first developed the Zero. So there was no armor protection for the pilot, and the gas tanks were not self-sealing. In other words, if there was a puncture of the gas tank, it was going to go right through and start a fire. I threw this one in because this is kind of an unconventional plane that not a lot of people know about. It's the Achi M6A1 Siren. And why it is important is this was another plot, another plan to get at the Allies. Now you see in the bottom of the slide, there's a submarine there. There were 3 of these planes that had wings that didn't fold up like a regular aircraft carrier airplane. It folded back sort of like a praying mantis, and they could fit them all in the tube like that. And the record is that the I-400 and the I-401 were going to, if the war had lasted long enough for them, they were going to take this submarine, Danny, and they were going to go right up the Potomac River and crash into the White House. So they kind of backed off on that plan. And then it was, they were going to attack the Panama Canal and destroy that so shipping could not get through. Finally, the last plan that they were going to do was to attack the Ulithi anchorage and kill as many American ships as they could. This is worth looking at, the two Mitsubishi bombers, the Nell on the right and the Betty on the left. The Betty is going to come into our discussion in a few moments. Both, again, they were Mitsubishi medium bombers because they only had two engines, limited armaments on them. Again, during their time, they were very effective. And if you remember from our Yamamoto program, it was the two Betty bombers there that were escorting Admiral Yamamoto on his inspection mission when he was shot down. This is a very, very interesting aircraft. It was never used in combat. Again, by the end of the war, the Japanese, they had almost no raw materials whatsoever. They were looking for a cheap aircraft that could be built from just whatever scraps were laying around, and I called it a Frankenstein airplane. This was going to be an aircraft that were going to be produced in large numbers and flown because they were already thinking that there was going to be an invasion of the mainland, and they wanted to be able to just send out hordes and hordes of aircraft to attack the invading forces. They were so bereft of materials that you see the landing gear on that airplane, it would, after the aircraft took off, the undercarriage would fall out so they could use it on another airplane. They never used this plane because it was deemed too difficult for trainees to fly. It was almost unmanageable. This is the Oka, the Cherry Blossom, purpose-built, single-seat Navy suicide attack aircraft. This is what was developed again by the Navy, and it was going to, at first they were going to use liquid rocket propellant like would be in the Messerschmitt 163, but they scrapped that in favor of the solid propellant rocket fuel. The later models had more powerful rockets, and there was a 2,000-pound warhead. Later models had to be lighter, and I'll explain to you why in the next slide or two. But this is sort of the layout of the Oka. The Allies called it the Baka, or the fool, or the ridiculous, because they first saw them, I believe, on April 1st, the first day of the Okinawa invasion. It was about 20 feet long, wingspan of 16 feet. It was essentially a glider during the testing phase, but then they put those rocket motors in the back. And this is how they were going to, okay, this is a picture there, a captured one that they're looking at the warhead on there. That is sort of a top, side, and side view. Okay, this is what I wanted to get to. This is the delivery method of the Oka. It was going to be in the belly of the aforementioned G4M Mitsubishi bomber. And as you can see, it would be lowered out of the bomb bay. The bomb bays were retooled, reshaped, and resized so as to fit this rocket glider inside. And then the pilot would climb down into the cockpit. They would lower it down, and at a certain range, because the glider bomb could not fly on its own for long distances, they would get as close as they could to the ships they wanted to attack and then release it. It would fall down, and then the rocket motors would ignite and they would try to fly into the ship. The only problem is that this added so much weight to the Betty that they were easy meat. And probably about the first 3 or 4 missions, they sent out about 10, 15, 20 of these bombers with the Oka inside of them, and they were all shot down. The record of the Oka, the rocket bomb, was very, very dismal. There was one ship that was struck and sunk. There were 2 or 3 other hits where the ship survived, but the failure of this whole program was pretty evident. This is where we're going to deviate a little bit. We're going to get back to the aerial aspect of the kamikazes, but this is what was called the kaiten. And I would defy any of you to want to get inside one of these because this was basically a manned torpedo. And you were the pilot. You were going to get in there, and the submarine was going to release these at a certain distance, and you were going to drive that torpedo right into the side of a ship. And this is what it looked like. This is the cutaway version. You could see the little green guy in the center at the top there, number 13. He's the pilot. And there is the detonator and the warhead, which is number 2 right there, all the way in the front. And that's about a 2,000 or 2,500 pound bomb, basically. And he's going to drive that right into the side of a ship. Again, because of the nature of where the war was at that time, we were sending out fleets of hundreds of ships, destroyers, destroyer escorts, aircraft carriers, escort carriers, cruisers, battleships, and they had developed a tactic after the first several ones of these got through, developed the tactic of having picket ships all the way around the fleet so as to have adequate warning whenever the Japanese were going to launch one of these. This is the Kaiten 10. It was probably the last one that was developed, as you can see. The cockpit where the pilot or driver would be right there in the center. The motor, all very simple, and that torpedo right up front. Other methods that the kamikazes were going to use was called the shinyo, or the fast motorboat. This was going to be driven by one person. These suicide boats were produced in a very great number because, again, they were expecting an invasion of the home islands. About 6,200 of these were made by the Navy, 3,000 by the Army. Of course, very simple. They took a boat, they loaded it full of explosives in the bow, and it was difficult to hit because, sort of like a miniature PT boat, it would approach the American or British fleet at very high speeds. Their record operationally, as we talked about the Baccas, was dismal. They sunk 6 landing craft and crippled 4 ships. What was happening is that even at night, the fleet, they would be sending up all kinds of flares, keeping the area lit as much as possible. And of course, they would have patrol boats circling that fleet. Here is something I'll bet none of you knew about. This was another Japanese weapon. It was called the lunge mine. We're going to talk about the land version in a second, but I'll save you the trouble of reading all the Japanese on the left-hand side of the screen. Basically, what this was going to be a battalion of frogmen. And again, preparing for the invasion. They had thousands of these suits that they were preparing. Of course, the end of the war came in August. They weren't expecting the Allied invasion until maybe at least the end of September or October 1945. So they weren't quite ready, but they did have a whole bunch of these in preparation. Now, how this works is you're going to get inside of this suit. Of course, it's going to have a pressure suit inside of it and some oxygen. And what these people were going to be doing was waiting at the water's edge. And when the invasion fleet showed up, it was going to be a very layered defense. The first layer was going to be these guys out in the water, maybe about in 30 or 40 feet of water, with a bunch of tethered mines that were already there. And they were going, when the boats would be coming in, they were going to loosen these mines so they would float to the surface and blow up the ships, the landing craft. The other line of defense, as you can see, the guy on the top, he's got the lunge mine, and they were going to be maybe in about 10 to 15, maybe 20 feet of water. And as the landing craft came in, they were going to take this lunge mine and push it right into the hull of the boat. Of course, it was going to explode. Of course, it would kill the frogman that was delivering that. That was the naval version. Here's the Army version. I don't know if you knew about this or not. This was an anti-tank mine attached to the end of a very long pole. It was called a lunge mine. And what they would do, and these were actually used on Okinawa, which we will talk about in a couple months. The lunge mine, the soldier would run up against the side of a tank, pushing this into the side of the tank. It would explode, hopefully destroying the tank, but also its deliverer would be killed as well. For some reason, I don't know why, I'm going to do a little bit of research on this, but the Germans were using the Panzerfaust, which was sort of like that and had a shaped charge on the end, but it had propellant, and it was sort of like a rocket launcher where it would shoot and hit the tank. These guys were going to push it against the tank physically. It didn't see the end of the Pacific War. The Viet Minh in the first Indochina War in the middle 50s used these as well against the French. Okay, now we're going to get to the meat of the matter. Okay, we're going to begin in October 1944. This is when the first deliberate kamikazes were dispatched. And one of the heaviest raids was on October 21st, hitting the heavy cruiser HMS Australia. It was probably a Val or Kate dive bomber. It hit the ship. The attack killed 30 people, including the captain. It also wounded about 64, but more importantly, it killed the Australian force commander, Commodore John Collins. By the end of October, there had been 55 kamikaze attacks. It hit 3 escort carriers, the Sangamon, the Santee, and the Swanee, and 3 smaller escorts, the White Plains, the Kalinan Bay, and the Katkun Bay. In total, 7 carriers were hit, as well as 40 other ships. 5 of them were sunk, 23 heavily damaged, and 12 moderately damaged. These early successes, such as the sinking of the USS St. Lo, were followed by an immediate expansion of the program. And over the next few months, there would be over 2,000 aircraft making such attacks. This is a starboard horizontal stabilizer from the tail of a Judy bomber. This is on the deck of the USS Kitkun, which we just talked about. The Judy made its run on the ship, approaching right from the stern. It was met with effective fire. The aircraft passed over the island of the aircraft carrier and exploded. Parts of the aircraft and the pilot were scattered all over the flight deck and the forecastle. This is a picture of the USS White Plains, which we just discussed. This is a Zero coming in at the end of its run, right towards the stern. You can see the arrestor wires that are raised there on the flight deck. The aircraft exploded in midair after the picture was taken, and again, the debris went all over the deck. This is a picture of the St. Lo that was attacked by the kamikazes on October 25th. Of the 889 men on board, 113 were killed or missing, and about 30 others died of their wounds later. The survivors were rescued from the water by the Heerman, the John C. Butler, and the USS Raymond. They all picked up about 434 survivors. This is a crewman in an anti-aircraft gun aboard the battleship New Jersey. They're looking on as a kamikaze aircraft dives into the USS Intrepid on the 25th of November. Here, about 75 men were killed or missing, and another 100 were wounded. This is one of the most famous pictures from the war in discussing about the kamikazes. This is Lieutenant Yamaguchi's Yokosuka, or the Judy, in a dive against the USS Essex on November 25th. And the attack here left 15 killed and 44 wounded. The dive breaks here are extended, and the non-self-sealing wing tank, as you can see, is already streaming fuel vapor and smoke. This is the attack on the other end where the explosion occurred on the Essex. The plane hit the port edge of the flight deck, leading landing among other planes that were already on the deck that were gassed and bombed up, waiting to take off. Here's something, again, maybe you didn't know. This is an all-Taiwanese kamikaze attack that was launched by a 50-man unit on a U.S. airfield in the Philippines in late 1944. And how this worked is that the Japanese transport planes flying, carrying the unit, they landed on the Allied airstrip. These guys come pouring out. They start shooting, throwing grenades, trying to blow up as many planes as they could. However, their fate was sealed and the entire force was quickly wiped out. Of the 80,000 Taiwanese who fought for the Japanese, about 30,000 of them died. Oh, Aunt Danny, she did it to me again. I have to make a note to self to make her stop doing this. Oh, here's our pop quiz, Danny. Betty Boop. Who doesn't know good old Betty Boop? What year did Betty Boop first appear? And again, I told you, if you don't get it, fine. If you do, fine. Get it, not get it, come down, I'll give you a book. Well, when was it? 1939, 41, 30, 43, or 45, Danny? Take a guess. 1930. Betty Boop first appeared in her cartoon, Dizzy Dishes. I'm sure such a cartoon could not be made today. So anyway, oh, here's something new, Danny. Look at this. Extra credit. What are these logos? Of course, you already know all about that. Two of them are pretty obvious, but what was their relationship to World War II? Okay. On the right-hand side, you see the very familiar Mercedes logo. The Mercedes logo, before 1926, 1927, it was just the three-pointed star. And what that meant was that Mercedes, with the Benz company created by Carl Benz, wanted to have products that were in the land, sea, and air, hence the 3 points. And I think it was 26, 27, when Gottfried Daimler joined, that they put a circle around it, and that is what we have had ever since. In the middle, of course, BMW, short for the Bergische Motorwerk, or Bavarian Motor Works. Again, a symbol you see all the time, but what does that mean? What's the center part of that logo mean? Okay, it's part blue, part white. That again signifies the sky. It also signifies propellers, which BMW during the war made radial engines for the aircraft, such as the Focke-Wulf. Over again, on the other side, Mercedes made aircraft engines too. They were more like inline engines for Messerschmitt. Now, here's the one you might not have gotten. What is those? What are those three? You know what those three? That's Mitsubishi. And the Mitsubishi logo stands for the three parts of a propeller, which, as we know, they made a lot of aircraft during World War II. So there's your extra credit for today. So let's move on. Okay, the USS Columbia is attacked by a Sonia, a KI-51. This is off of Lingen Gulf in January 1945. This is by a well-known Japanese scholar. It says, if someone asks you about the Yamato spirit, which is the spirit of old Japan, of Shikashima, the poetic name for Japan, it is the flowers of Yamazakura, or the mountain cherry blossom, that are fragrant in the rising sun. And what those Japanese characters in there say is simply Japanese kamikaze. Okay, the peak period of the kamikaze attacks, it was extreme frequency between April and June 1945, especially at the Battle of Okinawa. We are going to save maybe the most important, most catastrophic kamikaze attack for April. We'll discuss that then. However, on April 6th, waves of aircraft made hundreds of attacks around Okinawa. These attacks focused at first on the Allied destroyers that were on picket duty, and then on the carriers in the middle of the fleet, if they could get through. And this is another reason why the kamikazes in the end only 18% of the thousands of pilots that were sacrificed actually got through. And the reason for that, as I indicated, were the picket ships that were around the fleet, but also the very important combat air patrol that was circling the fleet constantly. If a plane got through the picket ships, got through the the combat air patrol, then they would make hits. Suicide attacks by aircraft or boats at Okinawa sank or put out of action at least 30 US warships. These are the ones that got through. The majority of them, of course, did not. Here are some Japanese Zeros being prepared for a last mission. And the founder, the commander of a lot of these missions, they actually published a handbook for kamikaze pilots. And in it gave important clues, important strategies and tactics on how to attack, a high-level attack, a low-level attack. And at the very end of their combat run, they told them, don't close your eyes, because if you close your eyes, you might miss your target. Of course, there was a sake ceremony before the pilots would take off. And what you need to know about this is that the majority of these pilots were hopelessly young, hopelessly undertrained, but they were full of zeal because they felt that by sacrificing their lives for the emperor, again, I said, honor, duty, and loyalty, that they would somehow be able to reverse the course of the war. Here's a picture of a bunch of guys all looking very happy. This is May 26, 45. Corporal Araki holding the puppy with 4 other pilots. He died the following day at age 17 in a suicide attack on ships near Okinawa. Onishi, who was the commander of a lot of the kamikazes, told the first unit he organized that their nobility of spirit would keep the homeland from ruin, even in defeat. Well, we know that that didn't happen. This is the aircraft carrier Formidable. We don't want to forget our British friends. This was struck by a kamikaze on May 4th, 1945. It made a hole 10 feet long, 2 feet wide and deep in the armored flight deck. 8 of the crew members were killed, 47 were wounded, and 11 aircraft were destroyed. Believe it or not, this aircraft carrier did not sink, despite the incredible intentional damage done to it. Here's a couple guys, very interesting story. Lieutenant Ogawa and Lieutenant Yasunori. They were going to attack the USS Bunker Hill. And the first guy, Yasunori, he would hit first. His bomb tore a hole in the port side of the ship, and the plane crashed onto the flight deck. The explosion destroyed, again, a lot of the planes that were on the deck that were fuel bombed up, ready to go. His plane dragged another plane overboard. There were actually 6 planes on this mission. Of the 6 planes that started, his and Ogawa's were the only ones that got through. The total catastrophic damage to the aircraft carrier, 393 American sailors died, 264 were wounded, and of course, these 2 guys died in their effort. This is a picture of the Bunker Hill in flames after being struck on May 11th, 1945, by the guy up there on the right-hand side that we just saw in the previous slide. This, as bad as this looks, yeah, it was bad. The Bunker Hill was sunk. The USS Missouri, we know about that. Shortly before being hit by a Zero up in the left-hand side. This again is one of the iconic pictures of the war. This was on April 11th, 1945. Of course, you know that the Missouri was where the Japanese surrender was signed. Look at this mess. Kamikaze damage to the destroyer USS Newcomb following action around Okinawa. The Newcomb was damaged beyond economical repair and was scrapped after the war. At least 40 enemy aircraft were observed in the area during the day, and at 1600 hours is when the attacks began. Though they were handicapped by a low ceiling, her gunners were able to drive off or shoot down many of the attackers. But over a period of half an hour, the Nukem was hit 5 times by 5 airplanes. With an effort that won them a Navy unit combination, her crew worked furiously to repair the damage. Look, I mean, you wouldn't think that anything could be done with this. And they were able to get the ship limped back to the Ulithi anchorage. However, she did suffer 18 killed, 25 of the sailors were missing, and 64 were wounded. The twin-engine aircraft were occasionally used in planned kamikaze attacks. For example, the Mitsubishi Ki-67 off of Taiwan undertook kamikaze attacks on the Allied forces with a pair of Kawasaki Ki-45 Nick heavy fighters. We'll be talking about them in a second. Caused enough damage to the destroyer USS Dickerson to be scuttled. The last ship in the war to be sunk, the Fletcher-class destroyer Callahan, was sunk by an obsolete wood and fabric Yokosuka K-5Y biplane off of Okinawa, which I have an example in our display case for you to come and see. The Dickerson was escorting a troop transport convoy, which we're going to talk about next. This is a picture of the USS Goodhue on the top left-hand side. The story about this is very interesting because this was my wife's father's ship that he served on. And at approximately 6:30, right around dusk on April 2nd, second day of the Okinawa invasion, Second Lieutenant Okatiro Takada's 8 Ki-25 Nicks crashed into the armed troop transports Goodhue, which is up on the left-hand side, Telfair, killing 25 and wounding 135. And a P-Y-1 Francis bomber slammed into the bridge of the Enrico, killing 49 and wounding 150. On that day, there were 12 ships in the armed troop transport convoy, as well as the escort Dixon. The Goodhue was on the right-hand column, right at the top. The Enrico was on the left, and the Telfair was on the right. Was when they were jumped by this bunch of Nicks. These are several of the sailors that were on board at the time: Radio Man Howard Hobbs, my wife's father, Signalman Jack Kennewell, and Signalman Ward McDonald. And what had happened is they had actually driven off a couple of the Nicks, but one came in and hit the mainmast of the ship and sort of cartwheeled down onto the deck. The bomb exploded. Aviation fuel went all over the deck, killing dozens and dozens of people. And the problem with this is they were shuttling Army troops to Okinawa that were going to be landed that day or the next day. And a good number of those Army guys were on the deck when it was attacked. About 30 or 40 of them were killed, and about another 100 or so were badly burned. And unfortunately, it was Radio Man Hobbs and Radio Man Jack Kennewell who were below deck when the plane hit. They came up, and when they saw what was on the deck, they couldn't believe. And it was part of their job was to clean up all the bodies and sew them up into body bags and then give them a proper Navy burial the next day. Signalman Ward McDonald was actually one of the last members of the Goodhue crew to die. I believe it was in 2017. Well, we're coming down to the end here, and on August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito finally threw in the towel, and in a radio announcement, he conceded defeat, told everybody to lay down their arms. But Admiral Mitomi Yugaki made a last entry in his diary noting that it was all his fault. He was to blame for the failure of the aviators to stop the enemy, and he would fly one last mission himself, showing the true spirit of Bushido. He climbed into a Judy dive bomber along with 2 other airmen. The radio man sent the last message at 1924 hours, reported that the plane had begun its dive into an American vessel. However, the U.S. Navy records don't show any kind of successful attack on that day, so we actually don't know what happened. But where have we seen Ugaki before? Do you remember where we saw the picture on the bottom left-hand side? Well, Ugaki was traveling with Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft that was going to do the inspection mission on Bougainville. He wasn't in the same plane as Yamamoto, but his Betty was shot down too. He suffered severe injuries, as you remember, in that attack. He was in the water for quite a long time, but he did survive, and he was promoted after that. Okay, here we are. We're at the end. We're going to talk about the cost. Although the kamikaze missions, they caused an enormous amount of damage and loss of life, they didn't succeed in sinking any ships larger than an escort aircraft carrier. And as you remember, it was those big flat tops that they were after. And the majority of the losses were sustained by the destroyers. Now, why was that? I think we talked about that briefly. It was those destroyers, those destroyer escorts that were out there forming the picket line around the fleet. And a lot of these Japanese flyers, when they were attacking, again, not a lot of training, not a lot of flying time. They saw a ship and it's like, okay, I'm going to dive right into that. So they would attack those destroyers first. That's why there were a lot of them that were lost. The statistics, again, they're all over the map, but from October 44 to August 45, there were 2,500 missions, organized missions that were flown, with only 475 achieving a hit or near miss. Of that, 12 were aircraft carriers, 15 battleships, 16 escort carriers. Those were all damaged. 45 ships total were sunk, including the escorts, USS St. Lo, which we talked about, the Omani Bay, and the USS Bismarck Sea. Also, again, 14 destroyers were sunk. Almost 5,000 British and American Navy personnel were killed. Now, something I forgot the last time, I'm not going to forget it this time. Here are the sources that I used to put together this program. And I mentioned Albert Axel's book, Kamikaze, Japan's Suicide Gods. Again, he was a Sanibel resident for many, many years. And I'm going to put my money all on that book right there. If you haven't read that book, you really need to, because it delves very deeply into the whole kamikaze phenomenon. The two books at the top are Osprey series books, East China Sea, Kamikaze. Torn of Kamikazes is an article I wrote for World War II magazine. Kamikaze Hunters, book in the library, Japanese aircraft. That gives all the hard nuts and bolts of all of the planes that the Japanese used during the Second World War. Again, any questions you have, email me, stop on down, see us, see what the library is all about. And that's all for today. Thank you. Awesome.